Welcome to True Echo, where real stories ring louder than fiction. Here we bring you powerful tales of justice, redemption, and truth that echo deep into the heart. Today's story is one of quiet strength, unexpected power, and the undeniable truth that some instincts are anything but noble. The air at Gate B14 was thick with the familiar cocktail of airport fatigue, burnt coffee, overcooked breakfast sandwiches, and nerves. It was a Monday morning, the kind that made time feel slower and people more restless. The kind of morning where delays seemed inevitable and patience wore thin like worn leather. Darian Hole stood near the end of the boarding line for first class, quiet and composed in a crisp navy blazer and a white Oxford shirt. His posture was relaxed, but there was precision in his movements, the kind that suggested habit, discipline, a rhythm honed over countless business trips. His leather messenger bag was slung over his shoulder, and under his arm was a worn paperback, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Not for show. He read it often. The gate agent smiled as he handed over his boarding pass. Darian nodded politely and stepped through without a word. No fanfare. No delay. Just another seasoned traveler boarding Flight 276 to Chicago Midway. He found seat 2A, first row window seat. First class wasn't about luxury for Darian. It was about space. Quiet. Peace. He settled in and opened his book before the hum of overhead bins even began. He didn't look around. Didn't need to. He'd been on this exact route a dozen times over the past year. Moments later, seat 2B filled. A woman, late 40s, perfectly groomed, hair pulled tight into a honey blonde chignon, designer coat, gold jewelry that gleamed like subtle declarations of status. Her heels clicked on the floor like punctuation marks. Whitney Apprentice. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent her life expecting doors to open before she knocked. She glanced at Darian, then did a double take, a flicker of something in her eyes. Confusion? Discomfort? He felt it without needing to see it. He kept reading. Whitney shifted in her seat, subtly but repeatedly. She fiddled with her scarf, checked her phone, adjusted the strap of her bag. None of it necessary. All of it intentional. The flight attendant offered pre-flight water. Whitney declined with a rehearsed smile. Darian accepted with a nod. Their hands didn't brush. Their eyes didn't meet. But the space between them pulsed with unspoken tension. So, are you going to Chicago for work? She asked, the kind of question that pretends to be polite but probes for something more. Darian didn't look up. Yep. You. Conference, she replied. Healthcare compliance. She added a short laugh, self-deprecating and tight. Thrilling stuff. He smiled faintly, turned another page. Government or private? Whitney raised her eyebrows as if surprised by the calm depth of his voice. Private. I consult. You. He didn't answer. Just gave a small nod and returned to his book. It was enough. More than enough. By the time the doors closed and the plane pushed back from the gate, Whitney had glanced his way 17 times. Not once directly. Always sidelong, always fleeting, but with increasing deliberateness. Darian felt it build, the subtle shift in posture, the quickened breath, the nervous tapping of her heel. He'd seen it before, grocery stores, elevators, gas stations, his own block. That quiet panic. That deeply embedded, unnamed suspicion that boiled to the surface in certain rooms. 15 minutes into taxiing, she couldn't take it anymore. Excuse me, she whispered to the flight attendant. Sorry? I know this might sound strange, but I'm feeling a little uncomfortable with my seat. Is there any way to move? The attendant blinked. Is the seat broken? No, she said quickly. I don't know. I'd feel safer elsewhere. Maybe after takeoff? He looked puzzled. I think we're full today. What's the issue? She lowered her voice, leaned in. It's just, the man next to me. Something about him. I don't want to cause a scene. Darian's eyes opened slowly. He turned his head toward her. Is there something you want to ask me? His voice was calm. Clear. Whitney froze. Oh no, I didn't mean. You're feeling unsafe, he said. I never said that. Yes, you did. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the row like a razor. The flight attendant stood awkwardly between them. If you want to ask me something, Darian continued, ask it. Don't dance around it. Whitney flushed. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I have instincts. A gut feeling. Darian leaned back in his seat. The gut. More passengers turned their heads now. The first-class cabin was no longer just listening. It was watching. The attendant excused himself to speak with a supervisor. Darian returned to his window view. Funny, he murmured, How your instincts only get triggered when someone looks like me. Whitney didn't respond. But her phone was already in her hand, thumbs working furiously. A narrative forming. One that she could tell herself later. Or tell someone in authority just in case. Darian sighed, not in anger but in exhaustion. The kind that settles deep into your bones when history repeats itself for the 100th time. He closed his eyes. But he didn't sleep. Not yet. 15 minutes in the air, and the silence was thicker than the clouds outside the window. Darian kept his posture relaxed, but every inch of his body was alert, not out of fear but out of experience. He knew this pattern too well. The long pause after an accusation, the momentary quiet before someone tried to rewrite what had just happened. His eyes were closed, but his ears caught everything. The whispers. The breathing. The way Whitney's fingers tapped against her phone screen like she was filing a report in real time. She hadn't looked at him since the attendant left, hadn't dared. But he could feel the heat radiating from her direction. Not warmth, but defensiveness. That desperate energy people give off when they know they've gone too far but still want to believe they're in the right. The plane leveled out. The seatbelt sign chimed off. A new attendant approached, older, more seasoned. Her posture was military straight, her voice clipped but professional. "Miss Apprentice?" she said. Whitney straightened as if she'd been waiting to be summoned. "Yes. Thank you for coming." The attendant knelt slightly by her seat, keeping her voice low but clear. "We understand you've expressed a concern?" Whitney nodded, her voice suddenly meek. "Yes, I didn't want to make a scene, but I feel very uncomfortable sitting next to this man. He's been watching me and earlier he said things that felt threatening." Darian opened his eyes fully now. He turned to both of them, gaze steady, jaw relaxed. "She means me." The attendant glanced at him, then back at Whitney. "Did he say something specific?" Whitney's lips parted, but her response stalled. Not exactly, but his tone. His energy. Darian exhaled slowly. "What I said, clearly and calmly, was, if you have something to ask me, ask it. That's apparently threatening now." "I didn't say you were dangerous," Whitney snapped, the mask slipping for a second. "You said I made you feel unsafe," Darian replied. "There's a difference in wording. Not in impact." The attendant held up a hand, professional but firm. "I'll speak to my supervisor. We'll handle this discreetly." She stood and walked off. Whitney turned to Darian, her face tight with frustration. "You didn't have to be so aggressive." Darian raised an eyebrow, didn't even blink. "I wasn't. You just didn't like being challenged." Her mouth opened, but no words came. Just the slow realization that what he said, and how he said it, was all being seen now by everyone around them. 10 minutes later, a new presence arrived. Taller, more composed, the kind of man whose suit didn't wrinkle and whose eyes missed nothing. Raymond, the flight supervisor. His demeanor was calm but deliberate. Crisis-trained. Trained to de-escalate. Trained for optics. "Good afternoon," he began. "I understand there's been a concern about seating. I just want to gather information so we can move forward appropriately." Whitney jumped in quickly. "Yes, I asked earlier to be moved because I felt very uncomfortable with my seat assignment, and I don't understand why that hasn't been addressed." Raymond nodded. "I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. Sir," he turned to Darian, "may I ask your side of the situation?" Darian looked him in the eye. "She doesn't like that I'm sitting here. That's the issue. Not what I've done. Just who I am." Raymond tilted his head slightly. "Was there any verbal exchange?" "She said she had a gut feeling," Darian continued, "that I gave her a bad vibe. That she wanted to be moved." Whitney looked stricken now, not because she disagreed but because hearing it out loud made it sound exactly as bad as it was. Raymond kept his voice measured. "Sir, would you mind showing me your ID? Just for documentation." There it was. The final trigger. Darian didn't blink. Didn't shift. Just calmly reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a black leather holder. He flipped it open with practiced ease. Gold. Bolt. Clean. Special Agent Darian Hull. Department of Justice. The air snapped tight around them like a vacuum. For one long second, no one breathed. Whitney's face drained of color, her jaw slack. Not in fear. In embarrassment. In recognition. In regret. Raymond's eyes flicked to the badge, then back to Darian. His tone shifted, now colored with a quiet respect. "Thank you, Agent Hull. I appreciate your cooperation." Whitney blinked. Her mouth opened to speak, but no sound followed. The words were gone. The truth was too loud. Darian leaned back in his seat. His face didn't gloat. His body didn't shift. He didn't even look at her. He didn't need to. Around the cabin, heads turned away, slowly, awkwardly, like witnesses trying to pretend they hadn't seen the scene unfold. But the story had already been written into the silence, carved into the recycled air of row 2. And no one was forgetting it. I didn't know, Whitney whispered eventually, her voice breaking. Darian turned slightly toward her, not in anger, just presence. Didn't know what? That you were, with the government. He cut her off. That I wasn't a threat. Her face crumpled just slightly and she nodded, the kind of nod people give when they realize they can't hide anymore. I guess that's the problem, he said. You needed a badge to believe I belonged here. Whitney lowered her head. I've never thought of myself as that kind of person. But you are, he replied, not cruelly but plainly. You did it without even realizing. Silence again. But now it wasn't just awkward. It was honest. I've seen this end worse, Darian continued. In neighborhoods. At traffic stops. Sometimes it doesn't stop at a conversation. Sometimes it ends on the pavement. Whitney swallowed hard. I didn't mean. I know, he said, but it still happened. This time she had nothing left to say. Not yet. The plane hummed steadily above the clouds, but row 2 was adrift in silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that pressed in on your chest and made every breath feel heavier than it should. Darian didn't move. His posture remained calm, but his mind had traveled far. Not to Chicago, not even to the badge in his pocket. It had gone somewhere deeper, into that familiar place Black Americans know too well. The space where identity becomes a question instead of a given. Where your existence is constantly evaluated by others before you even open your mouth. The badge had silenced Whitney. But it hadn't comforted Darian. Across the aisle, a young man in a hoodie gave him a small, respectful nod. One of those silent acknowledgments passed between strangers who've lived the same story in different rooms. Darian nodded back. That was the only recognition that mattered. Whitney sat frozen. Her phone screen was dark now, idle in her lap. Her fingers no longer danced. Her eyes didn't wander. She looked like she wanted to disappear, like her seat had turned into a witness stand and the jury was still watching. When the beverage cart rolled by, the attendant offered Darian a bottled water. Thanks, he said, voice low but composed. She moved to Whitney next. Whitney shook her head quickly. I'm fine. But she wasn't. Not even close. Darian unscrewed the cap, took a slow sip. He didn't speak, didn't gloat, didn't even glance her way. He didn't need to. The silence between them carried everything he could have said. Whitney cleared her throat once, lightly. He knew what was coming. He could feel it before the words formed. I didn't mean for it to go that way, she said quietly. Darian turned, just enough to let her know he was listening. He didn't speak yet. I don't know why I reacted like that, she continued. It was just, something felt off. I thought I was being cautious. He studied her for a long beat. Not cruelly. Not accusing. Just searching for honesty. Do you always get gut feelings when a black man is sitting next to you in first class? He asked evenly. Her mouth opened, then shut. No, You never asked my name, he said, cutting gently into her sentence. You didn't ask what I did for work or why I was flying. You made a snap judgment in 5 seconds and everything after that was about justifying it. I wasn't trying to. But you did, he said. She looked away. He continued, voice lower now, steady as ever. You didn't need me to do anything wrong. You just needed me to feel out of place. You were uncomfortable, so you assumed I was the problem. And when you didn't get the answer you wanted from the flight crew, you started building your own version of events. Whitney sat still, face pale, eyes fixed on the seat back ahead. That's the part people don't realize, Darian added. It's not always about what you say. It's about what you let yourself believe. I swear I didn't mean for it to be about race, she whispered. He tilted his head slightly. You didn't have to mean it. It already was. She closed her eyes for a second like she wanted to disappear into the dark behind her eyelids. Darian looked forward again. You know what the worst part is? He said, more to the window than to her. She didn't respond. That badge didn't make me feel proud, he said. It made me feel tired. She turned to him, confusion flickering behind the guilt. Tired of having to prove myself. Tired of needing credentials to justify peace. Tired of having to disarm people with calm voices and pleasant smiles just so they won't feel threatened by me sitting in a seat I paid for. I was scared, she murmured. He looked at her now. Really looked. No, he said. You were prejudiced. And when you got scared of what that said about you, you tried to turn me into the problem. Whitney bit her lip. I thought I really thought I wasn't one of those people. Everyone does, he said. Until they are. A sharp silence fell between them. Not violent. Not angry. Just real. And real was harder than anything else. 30,000 feet up, the truth didn't need shouting. It just needed space. And in that space, Whitney was drowning. Everything she'd built her self-image on, tolerance, education, civility, had cracked in the pressurized cabin of row 2. And she didn't know how to piece it back together. But Darian wasn't here to make her feel better. That wasn't his job. He turned back to the window, watching the clouds drift by like thoughts he no longer had time to entertain. His breathing slowed. His shoulders settled. Whitney, for once, didn't fill the silence. And that was progress. A few rows back, a man coughed. Someone unwrapped a snack with the crinkling sound of normalcy. The rest of the plane moved on as if nothing had happened. But row 2? Row 2 would remember. Darian leaned his head against the window again, but he didn't close his eyes. Not yet. He wasn't tired anymore. He was awake. Wide awake. When the cabin lights dimmed for cruising altitude, the tension in first class didn't ease with it. The rest of the passengers had retreated into their own bubbles, headphones on, trays down, eyes closed, but the space between seats 2A and 2B felt like a courtroom frozen mid-verdict. The soft drone of the engines couldn't drown out the echoes of what had just happened. Whitney hadn't spoken in over 10 minutes. Her body remained stiff, her eyes fixed straight ahead, but every now and then she would glance at Darian, quick, guilty flashes, like she was trying to gather the nerve to say something that would somehow untangle the knot she'd made. Darian didn't return the glances. He had nothing left to prove. Across the aisle, the young man in the hoodie was still watching. Not staring, just observing, silently absorbing what he'd witnessed. A quiet nod of respect earlier was enough. Darian wasn't looking for allies, but it mattered that someone had seen it for what it was. Whitney cleared her throat again, softly. This time, she turned her head fully toward him. I didn't think this was how the flight would go. Darian didn't respond. He wasn't interested in her comfort. I've been flying for years, she said, voice low. I've sat next to all kinds of people. I don't know what got into me. You do, he replied, not harsh, just certain. She flinched slightly. I wasn't trying to get you removed. Yes, you were, he said, still looking ahead. You just wanted someone else to do it for you. The words hit her harder than he intended, but he didn't take them back. Because they were true. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shift in his seat. And yet, every syllable felt like it carried a courtroom weight. Not to punish, but to reveal. Whitney looked down at her lap, her fingers pressing against the side of her phone, the screen still black. I thought I was being careful, she murmured. I thought I was just protecting myself. From what? He asked, finally turning to her. A man reading a book? She opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. That's what people like you don't realize, Darian said. You think your instincts are neutral, that your gut feelings are somehow free from bias. But they're not. You've been taught all your life, without even realizing it, what to fear and what to trust. I don't hate anyone, Whitney said, almost defensively. He gave her a long, calm look. Racism doesn't always wear a hood and wave a flag. Sometimes it whispers through body language or gut reactions, or a polite request to switch seats. She blinked quickly, clearly not used to being on the receiving end of such brutal honesty. I work with all kinds of people. Darian cut her off again. And how many of them have to show you credentials just to be believed? Her mouth stayed open, but no answer came. That's the difference, he continued. You get to be nervous. I have to be calm. You get to have a bad day. I have to be perfect. You get to ask for help and I get investigated. Whitney turned away again, but this time her shoulders had dropped. The defensiveness was fading. Shame was replacing it, not because she'd been caught, but because she was finally hearing it. I didn't think I was one of those people, she whispered again. You were, Darian replied. In this moment, you were. He didn't have to say more. The cabin around them continued to hum with the illusion of peace, but this wasn't about turbulence or clear skies. It was about truth. And truth was rarely quiet, even when it wasn't spoken. 30 minutes passed. Whitney hadn't moved. Darian had finally returned to his book, but his eyes weren't really reading. He could recite Invisible Man from memory if he wanted to. It wasn't the text he needed right now, it was the reminder. The irony of it all. A black man reading a book about being unseen while being scrutinized for existing. It would almost be poetic, if it weren't so exhausting. When the cabin lights brightened slightly for beverage service, Whitney stirred again. Her voice was softer now. Tired? Honest? Do you think I'll ever stop seeing the world the way I did this morning? Darian closed the book and placed it gently on his lap. He considered the question. That depends, he said. On what? On whether you only remember this moment, he replied, or whether you learn from it. Whitney looked at him then. Not with defensiveness. Not with fear. With a kind of aching recognition, like she was starting to realize that the apology wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I'm sorry, she said again. But this time she meant it. Not because he was a federal agent. Not because the cabin had gone silent. But because she finally understood what she'd done. Darian nodded slowly. You saw it? That's a start. She took a breath, a long one. I think I've gone my whole life assuming I was better than this. A lot of people do, he said. Until they're not. She didn't try to defend herself again. She didn't need to. The silence between them, finally, wasn't hostile. It was real. Wounded. Human. And sometimes that was enough. The plane began its descent. Seat backs upright. Tray tables locked. The rituals of landing began like clockwork. But in row 2 nothing felt routine. Whitney hadn't touched her phone again. Darian hadn't reopened his book. Because when truth sits between two people on a flight, there's no escaping it, not even when the wheels hit the ground. As the plane dipped through layers of gray cloud and the skyline of Chicago flickered into view beneath them, the pressure in the cabin subtly shifted. Tray tables snapped shut. Conversation started to bubble back to life. For most passengers the journey was nearly over. But not for the two sitting in row 2. Darian remained composed, back straight, hands calmly resting on his closed book. His face was neutral but not detached. Behind his eyes there was thought, deep, measured thought, the kind born from a lifetime of moments like these. Moments where someone else's discomfort becomes your burden to fix. Moments where you are forced to perform calmness, dignity, restraint, just to keep things from spiraling. Whitney didn't move. She sat with her hands in her lap, fingers clenched so tightly around her phone that her knuckles had turned pale. For the first time in what must have been years, she had nothing to say. No polite excuse, no spin, no self-preserving half-truth. Because Darian hadn't just revealed her bias. He had forced her to see it. To confront it. And worst of all, to admit it had always been there. I want to remember this, she said softly, breaking the silence as the wheels lowered with a hydraulic whine beneath them. Darian didn't look over. Then do. I mean it. I need to. Because if I forget, if I go back to the world and tell myself it was nothing, I'll just do it again. Somewhere else. To someone else. He finally glanced toward her. And what will you tell yourself it was next time? She hesitated, then shook her head. Not instinct. Not fear. I'll call it what it was. He didn't press her for the word. She needed to find it herself. Outside the window, the runway rushed up beneath them, and the plane hit the ground with a soft jolt. Passengers braced, exhaled, relaxed. The usual chorus of clicks and zippers began. The seatbelt sign dinged off. And still they didn't move. Whitney looked at Darian one more time. This time, no shame, no defense. Just a raw kind of vulnerability that hadn't existed an hour ago. I'm sorry I made you have to prove yourself. Darian nodded once. It shouldn't take a badge for basic respect. She blinked fast. You don't have to forgive me. I don't, he said. But maybe someone else will. Down the line. If you make this count. Whitney stood slowly, stepping into the aisle. She turned back, her voice steadier now. I will. Then she walked away. And Darian remained still. Not because he wanted to stay. Because for once he needed a moment to breathe. To reclaim his own space. By the time he stepped off the plane, the terminal was buzzing with the usual post-landing chaos. Announcements echoed overhead. Families reunited. Businessmen checked voicemails. Tourists fumbled with maps and bags. But Darian walked through it all with the same steady stride he had walked onto the plane with. Nothing loud. Nothing boastful. Just precise. Deliberate. Like a man who had already learned how to carry the weight without letting it break him. Near the baggage claim, a young black teenager stood staring at the arrivals board, hoodie half-zipped, sneakers scuffed, backpack slung low. He looked like he was waiting for someone, but his eyes locked onto Darian as he passed. The teenager's gaze dropped to the small flash of gold clipped at Darian's belt. Yo, are you FBI? He asked wide-eyed. Darian gave him a faint smile. Close enough. The kid grinned. That's dope. Darian paused. What's your name? Jalen. You stay sharp, Jalen. You'll get there. Bet, the kid said beaming. And just like that, Darian kept walking. He didn't need applause. He didn't need validation. But the nod from a kid like Jalen? That mattered. Because it meant someone saw him, not the badge, not the blazer, not the story the world tries to write for people who look like him, but him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to make the whole flight worth it. Outside the terminal, the wind cut sharper than expected for a spring morning in Chicago. Darian adjusted the collar of his coat, stepped away from the sliding doors, and let the crowd wash around him like water around a rock. He didn't rush to the curb. He didn't pull out his phone to call for a ride. He just stood there for a moment, letting the air cool his skin, letting the city's noise settle in his chest like gravity pulling him back to earth. The irony, he thought, was almost laughable. People thought power was loud, flashy. A voice raised. A badge waved. But he'd learned the truth long ago. Real power was in stillness. In walking into rooms where you were doubted and not flinching. In staying calm while someone else panicked over their own assumptions. The Uber arrived. Darian slid into the back seat without saying much more than, "Morning, and Hotel LaSalle please?" The driver nodded. No fanfare. Just city traffic rolling forward. He looked out the window, eyes scanning the faces on sidewalks, the shops, the morning commuters clutching coffees like lifelines. Nobody knew what had just happened 30,000 feet above their heads. Nobody knew that a federal badge had to be brandished just so a man could sit in peace. And that was the point, wasn't it? The problem wasn't that it happened once. It was that it happened everywhere all the time. In places without seat numbers and tray tables. In offices. In elevators. In boardrooms. In neighborhoods. Sometimes in uniforms. Sometimes in plain clothes. Sometimes inside you. His phone buzzed. A text. A known number. "I hope this isn't inappropriate. This is Whitney. The flight attendant shared your name when I asked. I wanted to say thank you again. And to apologize properly. I'm reflecting on a lot." Darian stared at the message. He didn't respond right away. He let the words sit there. Quiet. Uncomfortable. Honest. Then he typed. Darian Hull. Do more than reflect. Change something. He hit send. No punctuation. No signature. Just the truth. Later that afternoon, seated at a polished mahogany table in a government office near West Loop, Darian slipped easily into his role. He briefed 2 junior agents, reviewed a sealed file, spoke with a U.S. attorney over speakerphone about a developing case. No one mentioned the flight. No one asked how his morning had gone. But they noticed something. His tone was sharper. His pauses longer. His eyes heavier. They wouldn't know why. Not fully. Because the weight of being Darian Hull wasn't in the cases he solved. It was in the moments he didn't talk about, the ones that never made the reports. By evening the office emptied out. The golden sun hung low, casting streaks of orange and violet through the blinds. Darian leaned back in his chair, loosened his tie, and finally let out a long breath. He thought of Whitney again. Not out of anger. Not anymore. Out of hope. Hope that the version of her who left the plane wouldn't be the same as the one who boarded it. Hope that maybe, next time she'd stop herself before fear spoke louder than reason. Before prejudice disguised itself as instinct. Before comfort came at someone else's cost. The truth about bias was that it didn't announce itself. It whispered. It sat quietly beside you, nodding along while you convinced yourself you were just being cautious. It clapped when you made assumptions. It held your hand while you rewrote the story. But it never left quietly. It always revealed itself, sooner or later. Whitney Apprentice had learned that in row 2. And Darian? He just reminded her what happened when the truth shows up with a badge. 2 days passed before Darian saw her again. He was on his way out of the LaSalle's lobby cafe, a black coffee in one hand, his badge now tucked discreetly into the inner pocket of his blazer, not out of shame but because he didn't need it to walk tall. The conference he was attending had been a blur of suits, policy briefings, data presentations, and side glances from peers who only whispered, "That's him," once they thought he was out of earshot. Darian had long made peace with being both visible and invisible, depending on what people wanted him to be. But on that morning, just as he pushed the door open to step out into the sunlight, he froze. There she was. Whitney Apprentice. Standing across the street. She was different this time. No heels. No designer coat. Her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. She wore flats and a soft gray trench, the kind of thing people wore when they didn't want to make statements, just steps. And in her hands? A clipboard, a folded flyer, and a pen. Darian squinted slightly. Behind her stood a folding table. A sign taped to it read, "Bias lives in all of us. Change begins with awareness." He crossed the street slowly. No rush. Just presence. As he approached, Whitney looked up, and her breath visibly caught in her chest. She stepped forward instinctively, holding the clipboard to her chest like it might shield her. But then she caught herself, lowered it, straightened her back. "Agent Hull," she said, voice steady but soft. "Hi." Darian nodded. "Whitney." They stood in the quiet rhythm of city noise, cars, footsteps, snippets of conversation. But for a moment, nothing else seemed to move. "I didn't expect to see you again," she said. "I didn't expect to be seen," he replied. Whitney gave a tight, rueful smile. "I meant what I said. I wanted to do more than just apologize. I started reading. I joined a community program on unconscious bias. I've been talking to people, listening, hosting dialogues. It's uncomfortable, but it's real." Darian nodded. "That's good." She held up a flyer. "Would you speak sometime? Share your story?" He hesitated. Not because he was unsure of the answer, but because the weight of sharing wasn't small. He carried enough already. But this wasn't the same woman who had asked to be moved. This was someone who had let the mirror stay cracked and looked anyway. "I'll think about it," he said. Her smile widened, not in triumph but in gratitude. "That's all I can ask." He turned to go, then paused. "You remembered?" he said. Whitney tilted her head. "What?" "Back on the plane. You said you'd remember." She nodded. "I did. And I will." Darian took a step away, then turned back one last time. "Make it count." She held his gaze. "I am." And then, like any other moment in an ordinary city, they moved on. Two people who had shared an extraordinary confrontation, now changed by it in different but equal ways. Back in his hotel room, Darian placed his badge on the nightstand. The gold caught the fading sunlight, gleaming like it always did. But this time he didn't look at it with exhaustion. He looked at it with resolve. Because the badge wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of being heard. Some stories stay in your mind for a moment. Others echo for a lifetime. At True Echo, we tell the ones that challenge, inspire, and remind us who we are, and who we still need to become. This story wasn't about a badge. It was about being seen. About the power of pausing long enough to ask, what story am I telling myself, and who taught me to tell it? If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, even a little, share it. Start the conversation. And if you've ever been in Darian's shoes, we see you. Subscribe to True Echo for more stories that speak louder than noise. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And don't forget to pass it on.